to Watchmen on the Pod. All right, I wanted to read what I possibly can out of this article that I had found by Marsha Keith. It's Judaized. Let's see, how does it go? uh, Lord have mercy. It just escaped my mind that fast. Judaized Scots, Jacobite Jews, and the development of Cabalistic Freemasonry. That's what it is. We're in part three. I'm not exactly sure how much I can read off of this. Only reason being is because I no longer have Wi-Fi, and I had it downloaded on, I don't know what this thing is called. It's like a tablet or something. I'm not sure what it's called. I got it free. So anyway, I wanted to read what I can, and that's all I can do, guys. I am sorry. I don't have tethering on my plan on the phone. So, or what is it called? Hotspot. I have to pay more for that. So I just simply cannot do it. I'll read what I can. In 1736, when the Chevalier Ramsay informed his Parisian lodge brothers about the period of James IV's reign, he noted that the Scottish Masons followed the example set by the Israelites when they erected the Second Temple, who, while as they handled the trowel and mortar with one hand, and in the other the sword and buckler. During the minority of James V, increasing threats from the English king Henry VIII led the patriotic party to invite John Stuart, Duke d'Aubigny, to come from France to assume the regency. He ordered extensive stone reconstruction and fortification of buildings at all levels of society in preparation for an expected English invasion. He also led a party of Scottish nobles to France, where they observed the great Renaissance building projects in the Loire Valley, and one member, James Hamilton of Fanart, allegedly contacted Leonardo da Vinci at Amboise, who influenced his later architectural designs in Scotland. Throughout the period of the strengthened ties with France, many important Scots studied in Paris and participated in the tremendous revival of Lullism, led by Laferry de Estaples in 1536, who established a chair of Lullus studies at the Sorbonne and legitimized his essentially Cabalistic science as an area of Catholic inquiry. Laver had met Pico della Mirandola in Italy, and he was impressed by Pico's collaboration with Jewish scholars. Pico argued that Lullism was a form of Kabbalism and Ars Combinatoria, which provided a key to the universalist science that Lull's illuminated hospitallers were supposed to disseminate. Returning to Paris, Lefebvre published Lull's works on the crusading orders, visionary techniques, and mystical mathematics. In the process, he made the first recorded reference to the Kabbalah in France. He revealed to his students that the aim of the Hebrew sages was to translate the Kabbalah of letters into the secret magical philosophy of numbers, which was the source of the secret philosophy of Pythagoras. Mastering the numerical linguistic permutations of the Sefer Yitzhar, Levere also experimented with the architectural visualizations involved in Jewish temple mysticism. Like Lull, he seemed to incorporate these Kabbalistic visionary techniques into an architectural worldview, as suggested by a passage in his treatise De Maga Naturali. Heaven imprints on the minds of those influenced by the constellation Pegasus a true outline of future events, just as the architect, before he puts up a building, makes preparatory drawings from which he can visualize the structure that his fellow citizens will eventually see in reality. So heaven can instruct the eye of the mind to see past, present, and future. Influenced by Lull's praise of the unspoiled idiota, it is what it says, Idiota, idiota, Levere believed that simple, unlettered folk were capable of learning the art of memory, which would improve their practical skills. Encouraged by James V, Scottish students brought back the fruits of the Parisian studies in Renaissance Hermeticism and Christian Kabbalism, which were undertaken in the hope of reforming and universalizing the Catholic Church. The brilliant Scottish scholar George Buchanan, who praised his teacher Lefevre for bringing light out of darkness, would subsequently influence the Judaizing trends of James V's studies and religious practices. When Buchanan urged the king to eat the Passover lamb, critics charged that he wanted James to become a Jew and live as Jews do. Williamson argues that Buchanan was influenced by his Parisian contacts with Iberian Morenos, who retained much of their Jewish mentality after converting to Christianity. In the 1530s, James V directed a major architectural program in which he called upon Hamilton of Fenart to reconstruct the royal palaces for his successive French brides. Fenart then played a pioneering role in which he functioned more like a Vitruvian architect than a medieval master of works or master mason. He worked closely with the king, who was determined to use architecture as one of the principal symbolic activities of his reign. The two men collaborated on designs and practical instructions for their masons and may even have attended lodge meetings. The chronicler Lindsay of Piscati, or Spicoti, praised James' international outreach, for he plenished the country with all kinds of craftsmen out of other countries, as Frenchmen, Spaniards, Dutchmen, and Englishmen, which were all cunning craftsmen, every man for his own hand, in order to apparel his palaces. In 1537, James appointed John Scriamacmore of Myers as Master of Works, and in that same year, Scriamacmore prepared a transcript of Gilbert Hayes' translation of Lull's Book of Knighthood. The king, who was a student of Lull's alchemy, apparently commissioned the transcript, which was taken from the St. Clair manuscript at Roslin. James praised his friend Henry St. Clair as very serviceable in the intimate affairs of the royal court. It is possible that training in the lawless art of memory, which would be required of Scottish Masons in 1599, was already a part of their craft education, for Fenart demonstrated a striking ability to plan in 3 dimensions of priori, suggesting his own practice of lawless architectural visualization. James and Fenart made Stirling Castle a spectacular expression of Renaissance humanism, with stone sculptures of hermetic emblems and a sun god shining blessings on the alchemical king, while behind the carvings, the ashlar is amongst the finest stonework ever seen in Scotland, so close jointed that after 450 years of windy exposure, there is virtually no weathering. When James brought his bride, Queen Madeleine, from France, he was accompanied by a French master mason, Moses, or Mogne Martinin, whose unusual forename suggests a Jewish or Marianist background. After Madeleine's death, James traveled with Martinin to France, where they studied together the Renaissance features of palaces built for Francis I, a friend and patron of Levere d'Estaples. If Martinine had an Iberian Marianist background, he or the king's Spanish Masons may have influenced James's unusual design for a Solomonic Gothic fountain at Linlithgow, which bore a striking resemblance to the Fountain of Lions in the Alabama. Returning with a new bride, Mary of Guise, he asked his Guise in-laws, who were great builders, to send talented French masons to Scotland. That the Guises were often compared to the Maccabees because of their feeling of blood and brotherhood and devotion to sacred architecture gave them an unusual affinity with the Maccabean Masonic traditions of Scotland. James V entrusted Finart with important affairs of state, and the courtier architect became a powerful figure in Scottish governance. Working with the Master of Works was John Ayton, Master Mason, whose family would provide Masonic service to the Stuart kings until 1638, when they helped organize the Judaizing Covenanters' rebellion. That turbulence, which led to the British Civil War, was foreshadowed in the sudden fall of Finart, who was accused of treason and executed in 1540. Excuse me. McKeon suggests that he fell victim to a Protestant ambush, for several notable reformers contributed to his downfall. Hamilton's role as architect for the greatest and most prolific of all Scots building monarchs made his downfall a wonder of the age. For Masonic history, it marked the beginning of a destructive period of political turbulence, religious hostilities, and architectural neglect, as the violent forces of the Protestant Reformation swept into Catholic Scotland. After Henry VIII broke with a Roman church and declared England a Protestant country, he pressured James V to follow his example and join an anti-papist campaign. However, James remained loyal to Rome and the French alliance, which drove Henry to mount an invasion of Scotland in 1542. Shocked by the death of his favorite Oliver St. Clair in battle, the king went into a decline and soon died. His and Finart's dream that Scotland would earn its place upon the European stage as much by architecture as it had by arms was frustrated for the next 50 years, as a series of regents and queens struggled with the turbulent changes of the Reformation. Encouraged and financed by Henry VIII, the more radical Scottish Protestants joined his campaign to destroy Papist images and architecture, a campaign which Colvin calls the greatest single act of architectural vandalism in English, perhaps even European history. In England, between 1536 and 1540, every monastery was dissolved, and the great majority of their buildings were plucked down or defaced. This was done by the authority of a grasping and tyrannical king, and effected by his minister Thomas Cromwell, through subordinates who were for the most part ruthless, cynical, and Philistine men. Among Cromwell's targets was the Hospital of St. Thomas of Acre, whose knights had long supported the Masonic fraternity. After a Protestant mob smashed the images of Becket in sculpture and stained glass, Henry VIII dissolved the order and sold the severely damaged building. Over the next decades, the rivalry between Catholics and Protestants was often interpreted in terms of the image versus the word, of visualization versus verbalization. In 1542 to 64, when the Council of Trent launched the Counter-Reformation, the Roman churchmen advocated the use of beautiful art and architecture as a weapon in the war for hearts and minds. In England and Scotland, this manifesto hardened the anachronistic attitudes of radical Protestants who not only destroyed ecclesiastical and royalist architecture, which expressed papist themes, but condemned the lowest art of memory as papist image worship. Still, in Catholic Scotland, the widowed Mary of Guise served as de facto regent for her infant daughter Mary Stuart, and as Queen Mother, she struggled to continue her predecessor's architectural policies and collaboration with Masons. Like James IV and James V, she relied on her master of works for sensitive political and diplomatic missions, and she worked closely with loyal teams of Masons whose social and political prestige she tried to elevate. Excuse me. This collaboration contrasted starkly with the current situation in England, where the Reformed Parliament passed acts in 1548 against the Masons and other craftsmen who conspire to raise their wages. Because of rapidly rising food prices and the loss of work after the dissolution of the monasteries, the living standards of Masons in England declined perceptuously over the next decade. Newly hewn stone was replaced by brick on major building projects, while so many reformers stripped the stone off ecclesiastical buildings for their private use that many Gothic edifices simply disappeared. In 1548, Mary of Guise commissioned Robert Wedderburn, Chamberlain to the Knights Hospitallers, to write The Complaint of Scotland, a passionate argument for Scottish independence and the French alliance, which was replete with Maccabean, Masonic, and Crusader imagery. Wedderburn's two brothers had converted to Protestantism, but he worried about the increasingly violent religious polarization and English intrusion into Scottish governance. Thus, he urged the Scots to undertake reforms within the Catholic Church and to remain faithful to their Hebraic heritage, which the Protestant dissidents threatened to corrupt. Comparing the Queen Mother to the great Jewish heroines Esther and Judith, who saved their people in dangerous times, he identified Scottish nationalists with the Maccabees, who refused foreign domination and destruction of their national temple. Evoking memories of the recent burning of Edinburgh, he described the similar destruction of Jerusalem. Despite the temporary victories of their enemies, the Maccabees remained faithful to their tradition and drove the invaders out of Jerusalem. Then they reformed the destruction of the temple. Like the Jewish heroes, Scottish patriots should be zealoters of the law of God and give your souls for the alliance of your forefathers. Curiously, by the 18th century, a Cabalistic degree of zealotator would emerge in Scots Freemasonry. In his approach to history, Wedderburn utilized the Hebraic conceptions of Paul of Burgos, a Jewish convert who drew on the Talmud. In his approach to narrative, he imitated the Hermetic use of actor and author as teacher, master of disciplines, guru. These two strategies were applied especially in his description of the two pillars built by Seth to preserve the world's knowledge in time of flood and fire. He elaborated the account in Josephus to include Hermetic and Masonic accretions, which stress the importance of mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and cosmography, whose secrets were engraved on the pillars. Foreshadowing later Freemasonic developments, he referred to the magical roles of Hermes and Joseph in Egypt, when the latter taught the Pharaoh the secrets of Jewish science. The outstanding Hebrew and Egyptian rulers all stressed the importance of the sciences, crafts, and mechanics to a nation's well-being. Wedderburg's usage of Jewish lore in his propaganda tract would find a receptive audience among young Scots, for many were studying Hebrew in local grammar schools. Hume Brown notes that except for the Netherlands, Scotland had more primary and secondary schools than any other country in Europe, and that education was placed within the reach of all classes. Moreover, Hebrew was currently spoken and read in these schools long before it became established in the universities. George Buchanan, who was still Catholic but increasingly sympathetic to Protestantism, drew on his Hebrew studies under Levere and contact with Morenos in Bordeaux to write two Judaized dramas, The Baptist or Colomany and Japheth or The Vow, which alluded to Antiochus' desecration of the temple once the crown of Solomon's magnificence and the Jews' determination to maintain the covenant of old in the face of foreign challenges. As Williamson observes, Buchanan experienced a significantly crypto-Jewish environment, which appeared publicly as faultlessly Catholic, but was privately informed by elements of Jewish religion and identity. Assisted by the Knights Hospitallers and Garde Escosses, Mary of Guise got her young daughter safely off to France. She then worked with Archbishop John Hamilton, a kinsman of Fenart and discerning patron of architecture, to repair the damage to castles and churches which caused the latest battles with radical Protestants. When the archbishop became ill in 1552, she recruited Girolamo, or Cardano, to Scotland, for she hoped to exploit his expertise in hermeneutic medicine, military engineering, and Masonic fortification in her struggle against England. Though Cardano was scorned as a papist magician by reformers, Mary believed he could provide similar service to Scotland as Nostradamus, employed by the Guises, did for France. Moreover, Cardano had met Nostradamus and was aware of his Jewish ancestry and of his boast that he inherited the predictive powers of the tribe of Issachar. He himself explored Cabalistic theosophy, which he utilized for experiments in Ars Combinatora. Cardano cured the archbishop and many others, while he won admirers by his phenomenal feats in mathematics, memory, and precognition, second sight, which he attributed to his mastery of the lawless art. Given his host's interest in improving the expertise of Scottish architects, masons, and artists, his argument that many men can be trained in his art of visualization and divination was important. Moreover, he observed that those predictions are most reasonable which concern the development of the arts, such as the craftsman's art. Among the witnesses to his lawless demonstrations may have been the young William Shue, who served as a page to Mary of Guise and who, as master of works in 1599, would make training in the art and science of memory a requirement for operative masons. In 19th century Escocese mason J.M. Ragon would claim that Cardano made a significant contribution to Masonic science. Like many intellectuals, Cardano was a liberal Catholic who hoped for reform within the church, a position advocated by his patient Archbishop Hamilton in 1552. When he disapproved of the persecution of Protestant heretics, Cardano perceived the Reformation Party in Scotland as intolerant and prone to violence. When Mary of Guise became official regent in 1554, she called for a policy of liberty of conscience, hoping to recreate the more tolerant atmosphere of the early humanist era in Paris. She determined to endow royal lectureship to train young Scots in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. However, as Durkin notes, her wider scheme involving Hebrew and thus divinity seemed too threatening to Protestant forces in the universities. Her effort was supported by John St. Clair, Dean of Restalrig, who returned from Paris to argue that freedom of worship he granted to Catholics and Protestants. Meanwhile, in England, the death of the Catholic Mary Tudor in 1558 and succession of the Protestant Elizabeth I accelerated the iconless campaign. While Elizabeth cracked down on Masonic organizations and allowed the further deterioration of English Office of Works, Mary of Guise elevated the status of Royal Masons and influenced the election of her French Master Mason, Thomas Roytel, as a burgess in Edinburgh. With the fifth Lord Seton, an architectural enthusiast, serving as provost in Edinburgh, she determined to protect the churches from attacks by radicals bent on destruction of Gothic images. Among the targeted buildings was the great Charterhouse of Perth, founded by James I, which was destroyed by a Protestant mob. John Knox, the charismatic reformer whose violent sermon inspired the attack, expressed his delight at the expulsion of friars, the smashing of the tabernacle on the altar, and the destruction of Gothic carvings. Within 2 days, these three great places, monuments of idolatry to wit, the Grey and Black Thieves and the Charterhouse monks, a building of wondrous cost and greatness, were so destroyed that the walls only did remain of all those great edifications. The destruction of the Charterhouse would reverberate in Masonic memory for decades, and in the Muses Theodonini, 1638. Henry Adamson paid tribute to its multinational Masons and to those Hebraically heroic citizens who tried to defend it. Like Manasseh's half-tribe, Reuben Gad, who left their cattle at Mount Gilead, many Perethians fought back against Knox's radicals. After Mary of Guy's death in 1560, the Protestant-dominated Parliament in Edinburgh abolished the jurisdiction of the Pope and banned the Catholic Mass. Protestantism became the official, though not the majority, religion in Scotland. Moreover, despite Knox's heresies against Papist architecture and the superstitious rituals and festivals of the craft guilds, the greater number of Masons and artisans remained Catholic. With the return from Paris of the new Queen Mary Stuart, her French spelling of the surname, there was a revival of courtly interest in Hebraic and Hermenetic mystical traditions, an interest the Queen shared with her Guise kinsmen. She welcomed a delegation of French humanist scholars who were dedicated to Cabalistic, Hermetic, Platonic regeneration of the Catholic Church. Dorston points out that religious Hermeticism encouraged its adepts to work for toleration and conciliation, that their message received a warmer welcome in Edinburgh than London at that time. One French poet praised the Queen and her scholarly mentor, the Judaizing Buchanan, for reviving the traditions of religious verse immortalized by the great David, king of the Jews. Mary not only acquired the Pomander of Hermes Trismegistus, but the Dialogues d'Amour of Leon the Hebrew. Well, that's crazy words. A work that merged the architectural mysticism and sexual theosophy of the Kabbalists with Hermetic and Neoplatonic themes. Her son would later draw on both works. Though Cardano could not accept the Queen's invitation to return to Scotland, the brilliant Huguenot scholar Joseph Scaliger paid an influential visit in which he reinforced the Hebrew interest of Buchanan and other courtiers. Scaliger had been so inspired by the expertise in Jewish lore of Guillaume Postel that he learned Hebrew, visited Jewish communities in France and Italy, and conversed with masters of Kabbalah and Talmud. He was also intrigued by the lawless art of memory, and he described spectacular demonstrations of its effectiveness, which he witnessed in Italy. Scaliger's subsequent studies of ancient Jewish mystical fraternities and Masonic guilds would have a significant influence on Mary Stuart's son, James VI, when the latter undertook the revival of Royalist Masonry. Despite her desire to maintain the Stuart Guise tradition of emblematic architecture, Queen Mary was unable to launch any ecclesiastical or royal building projects because of the religious and financial austerity imposed upon her by Parliament. Thus, her reign represented a hiatus in the long tradition of practical collaboration between Masonic monarchs and craftsmen. Nevertheless, according to the 18th century Freemasons, the lodges maintained their secret teaching and preserved it until better days. In 1733, a London periodical, the Free-Mason, summed up this period of Masonic history. On the sunset of Masonry in the southern and western part of the globe, the ancient Masons of Scotland, Stars of the North, preserved its light and returned it to mankind. According to Chevalier Ramsay, the special Scottish light was the visionary theosophy of the Kabbalists handed down by oral traditions from him, Grand Master Noah, to Abraham and the patriarchs, the last one of which our sublime art into Egypt. Let me read that again. Handed down by our oral tradition from him, Grand Master Noah, to Abraham and the patriarchs, the last one of which carried our sublime art into Egypt. Since then, the secret science can be preserved pure only among God's people, the mystical Jews. However, religious polarization made the question of which Scots were God's people, Catholics or Protestants, a provocation to violence as both parties struggled for Scotland's Maccabean soul. During the imprisonment of Queen Mary by the Elizabethan government, Scotland was ruled by a regency during the minority of her son, James VI. Protestantism now became the majority religion of the kingdom, though it was split between the Presbyterian Kirk with congressionally elected elders and the Episcopalian Church with royally appointed bishops, while a substantial minority remained stubbornly Catholic. James was tutored by Buchanan, who inculcated staunch Protestant beliefs in his intellectually gifted and erudite pupil. Though Buchanan had become rigidly Presbyterian, he still maintained contact with Christoph Plainton, whose Antwerp press, The Golden Compasses, published works by the Family of Love, an international secret society that included Protestants, Catholics, Morenos, and which maintained strong lawless interests. Chafing under his tutor's severity, James developed private Iranic beliefs quite similar to the familists who worked for religious consolation. Their hierarchical structure, esoteric theosophy, and ecumenical goals led some historians to characterize them as pre-Masonic. Sharing the royal classroom were several precocious youths, such as the Admirable Crichton, who would gain European fame as an expert in Kabbalah and the art of memory, and George Erkinson of Ontario, who would develop Cabalistic, Rosicrucian, and Masonic interest. From his mother's library, James gained access to the Hermetic, Cabalistic, and lawless works of the earlier French humanists, and he developed a strong sense of Scotland's Hebraic Egyptian traditions. At his ascension in 1579, the iconic figure of Dame Scota appeared and spoke to the new king in Hebrew. As Hebrew studies became more widespread, a young stonemason, William Aird, became so expert in the language that he was urged to leave his handicraft to become a Presbyterian minister. However, he continued working with his fellow laborers and was perhaps the source of the Hebrew manuscripts later found among a cache of Masonic documents and mentioned in an Aberdeen text of 1670. Erd was familiar with Andrew Melville, a radical Presbyterian and learned Hebraist who brought many Jewish and Cabalistic works to Scotland, including Johann Rechlin's De Verbo Mirifico, who allegedly influenced the increasing mystical sense of the Mason word. In 1581, James VI's religious tolerance and interest in continental scholarship so worried the radical Presbyterians that they pressured him to sign the King's Confession, which repudiated the papacy and affirmed Scotland's role as Hebraic preserver of the true religion. As Williamson notes, the oath became a covenant involving the full-hearted consent of the people and king, whose act in unison with God bore a genuine resemblance to the Jewish experience. By 1583, James's distress at increasing religious discords made him determined to draw the nobility to unity and concord and to be known as a universal king. He took as his motto, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and he portrayed himself as Scotland's Solomon. He also determined to revive royalist and religious architecture as a unifying expression of Scotland's heritage and independence. He thus appointed a political moderate and private Catholic, William Shue, as King's Master of Works, and he worked closely with him in architectural, political, and diplomatic affairs. Since his youth at Mary of Guy's court, Shue was familiar with Cardano's advocacy of the importance of the lawless art to the improvement of arts and crafts, and James was also a student of Cardano's writings. At this time, James VI was translating the poetry of Guillaume de Solesty, Sieur de Bartas, a French Protestant who included the Solomonic themes and technical terminology of operative masonry in his epic works, the Simonis, Divine Weeks. When James translated Du Barty's Uranie, he found reinforcement for his committee to architectural and Masonic revival. Hiram's Holy Help in War Unknown, what he is building, Israel's temple, had shown. Without God's ark, Basil Jew had been, in everlasting silence, buried clean. Then, since the beauty of those works most rare hath after death made live all them that wear, their builders, though themselves with time be failed, by spoils, by fires, by wars, and tempests bewailed. A particular relevance to James and Shue was the section of Sermines called the Columns, in which Du Bartas argued that the Masonic traditions of Seth's two pillars were preserved and transmitted by the Jewish Kabbalists. Thus, old Seth taught his children how to construct a sumptuous building. But by tradition, Cabalistic taught that God would twice reduce this world to naught. By flood and flame they regard cunningly this stately pair of pillars which you see. Long time safekeeping for their after kind, I think. 100 learn mysteries therein. So kin therein. Let me say that again. Long time safekeeping for their after kin, 100 learn mysteries therein. Drawing on the Sefer Yitzhak and esoteric geometry, no, that's not geometry. Yeah, it is. Du Bartas described the number, mysticism, and practical tools which could produce great architectural and Masonic expertise. In its geometry, the craftsman guide, mother of symmetry, the life of instruments of rare effect, law of that law which did the world erect. Here's nothing here but rules, squires, compasses, weights, measures, plumets, figures, and balances. Lo, where the workman with a steady hand ingeniously a level line hath drawn, warlike triangles building fit, quadrangles. That wasn't a good poem. In 1587, James invited de Bartos to Scotland, where they translated each other's works and exchanged ideas about God as divine architect, Solomon as visionary architect, and Cabbalas as Masonic word builders. The king was currently reading French editions of the Book of Maccabees, Phileo, Josephus, and Leo Hebraeus, which is Abravelnel, while Dubartas was immersed in further Cabalistic studies. When Dubarto returned to France, he praised James as the embodiment of the great Jewish kings, the Scottish, or rather the Hebrew David, whose religious poetry shall sound in high-built temples, where the unilluminated with hands profanely vile cannot enter. For he, I hope, who no less good than wise, first stirred us up to this great enterprise, and gave us heart to take the same in hand, for level compass, rule, and squire will stand, and will not suffer in this precious frame aught that a skilful builder I may blame. The English Masonic historian Hamel, who was unaware of Dubarta's influence on James and Shaw, observes that the French poet's Masonic imagery and emblematic pillars seem to foreshadow modern Freemasonry. Dubartos made poetic references to the art of memory, and he urged the craftsmen to imitate Moses and Bezalel, print even faster in thy faithful brain the mathematical and technical skills necessary to modelize to inward sight the admirable form. Thus, it is not surprising that James VI welcomed to his court disciples of the Hermemetist Cordano Bruno, whose advocacy for the lowest art of memory was scorned in England as papist image making. Though Bruno was essentially anti-Jewish, he drew on Cabalistic traditions when he instructed students in the art. Moreover, according to his Scottish confidant, Alexander Dixon, he included a practical form of the art which stressed the technique of architectural visualization. Dickinson, in turn, instructed Hugh Platt, an alchemist and inventor, in a simplified, non-mystical version of the art. You must make choice of some large edifice or building, whose chambers or galleries be of some reasonable receipt, and so furnish unto you as that every part of each of these may represent itself readily unto the eyes of your minds when you will call them. In every of these rooms you must place 10 several subjects at a reasonable distance, one from the other. These subjects should be such as are more apt, as Master Dixon termed it, to animate the umbras or ideas rerum morenda memorandii. Okay. Platt, who tried unsuccessfully to interest some operative Masons in London in his inventions, would later be knighted by James VI, and won for his technological contributions. After Bruno and Dixon were attacked by Scottish Calvinists at Oxford, they left England, but Dixon later participated in James VI's court in Edinburgh, where, as master in the art of memory, he befriended several architectural ambition quarters. Almost done here. With his interest stimulated by Dubartas and Cardano's, James asked the poet William Fowler, a friend of Bruno, to instruct him in the art of memory, and Fowler wrote a treatise now lost on the subject. Shaw had been in Paris when Henry III made Bruno a royal reader, and he was familiar with the Catholic acceptance of Cabalistic lullism as a legitimate art. He soon had an opportunity to give it architectural and theatrical expression. In 1594, to celebrate the baptism of Prince Henry Stuart, Shaw collaborated with James on a plan for the rebuilding of the Chapel Royal at Stirling Castle. By imitating the measurements of Solomon's temple, the design would proclaim James as Solomon. Fowler, the memory expert, wrote the script for a great masque which featured the great Temple of Solomon, which is a building. Shaw's craftsmen from the Office of Works, who included masons, hammermen, carpenters, and painters, participated in the design, construction, and staging of the mystique and hieroglyphic scene. which also featured the initiation and oathing ceremonies of the crusading Knights of Malta. In 1598 to 99, when Shu reorganized the Mason's craft and virtually created modern Freemasonry, he made training in the art of memory and the science thereof a requirement for initiates into the fraternity. Though his explicit requirement seems innovative, Stevenson notes that the statutes speak of it as something long established. Significantly, the Master Masons had to be expert enough to the art to test every entered apprentice and fellow craft in the science. Thus, these leading operatives must have studied Lola's and Brunonian treatises on the subject. Jonathan Swift would later draw on 17th century Scottish Irish traditions when he affirmed that it's impossible to come at the quintessence of Freemasonry without a key to Re Mundus Lolus. From the surviving Scottish Lodge records and literally allusions it to clear that speculative gentlemen as well as operative craftsmen gained access to the esoteric traditions as well as the practical skills of the fraternity. Circa 1601, the king asked to be admitted into the Masonic Lodge at Perth, and he continued to participate in the fraternity's affair through the rest of his reign. And I'm thinking, this is King James. Am I right? Or am I wrong here? Those years add up to King James. Hold on. With his and Shu's commitment to the craft, the transformation that made speculative gentlemen and operative Masons into Freemasons was now underway. At Shu's death in 1602, he was praised as a great architect, cosmopolitan intellectual, and devoted servant of the king. In 1603, when James VI became James I of the United Kingdoms of Scotland, England, and Ireland, he proclaimed himself Great Britain's Solomon. He and his architecturally ambitious courtiers now took their Hebraic mystical and technological lore south to London. However, they soon learned that there was no equivalent Freemasonry in England, where royal and ecclesiastical architecture had long been neglected, and the Mason's craft had seriously deteriorated. As the Stuarts' loyalist John Aubrey lamented, in Queen Elizabeth's time, architecture made no growth, but rather went backwards. Many of James's New English subjects openly mocked the Scots' Jewish identification and made fun of the king's aversion to pork. Even more laughable were his attempts to discuss his studies in natural magic and second sight. However, the king determined to continue his Scottish architectural program by redesigning London as a fireproof city of brick and stone. In the face of Puritan opposition to his Solomonic pretensions, he received enthusiastic support from John Gordon, a Scottish Hebraist and friend of Du Bartas, who was named Dean of Salisbury by the king. In Sermon on Great Britain, 1604, Gordon explained how the order architectonic of building is based on Hebrew traditions of Cabalistic word building, which justified the king's policy of church reconstruction and revitalized ceremony. A critic complained that Dion Gordon, preaching before the king, used certain Hebrew characters and other Kabbalistical collections to approve Papist-style art and ceremonies. The Judaizing dean then devoted much revenue and time to the Masonic repair of the Gothic cathedral at Salisbury. Through reinforcement came from Joshua Sylvester, who dedicated to James his English translation of Du Bartas' Divine Weeks, 1605, which featured an architectural poem in the shape of two pillars that form a temple and another that forms a pyramid, both emblematic of the Temple of Jerusalem. To improve the expertise of London Masons, James brought south his Scottish master of works, Sir David Cunningham, who had collaborated with Shaw and was evidently trained in the art of memory. James appointed Cunningham as co-surveyor of works with the aged mason William Spicer, a move which created English resentment at this Scottish intruder, who was honored as the Lord Architect by the king. As in Scotland, the king encouraged the elevation of talented artisans into gentlemen and even noble status. Ben Jonson, a former bricklayer, and Ingo Jones, a former joiner and painter, were employed to develop the architecturally themed masks which expressed James' Solomonic policies and Hermetic Cabalistic interest. Howarth notes that the Stuart masks were an inventive type of temporary architecture, and their production involved teams of craftsmen from the Office of Works, led by Jones, who became the king's Master of Works in 1615. Over the next decades, Jones infused his most serious theoretical assumptions about architecture into the text of his masks. James hoped that Jones' recent visit to Italy, where he observed Paladine design and operative masonry, would enable him to become the William Show of England. Jones, in his turn, sent his master mason, Nicholas Stone, to Edinburgh, where he became a close friend of Sir David Cunningham, son of the former Master of Works, who would later organize a quasi-Masonic secret fraternity among the Scottish quarters in London. Stone worked closely with the Scottish master mason, and he gained access to their sophisticated techniques of stonework, and at least partially to their esoteric Hebrew lore. When Nicholas's kinsman, John Stone, Freemason, died in 1618, one of James's master masons carved an epitaph about his labors to build God's temples, which proved that God can of stones raise seed to Abraham. Like the Scottish Masons, Nicholas now identified with the Jewish builders of the temple, and he would later carve Solomonic spiraled pillars. A top priority for the king was the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral, for its derelict state was cited by foreign Catholics and Bruno as a sign of the degraded state of Protestantism in England. However, he was surprised to meet stubborn resistance from many preachers and parliamentarians who carried on the Tudor tradition of devaluing the visual arts and architecture as papist in essence and ungentlemanly in practice. That Johnson and Jones, producers of his architecturally themed mask, were private Catholics who attended Anglican services, made their role a provocation to resist by Puritan inoculus. In 1610, the Scottish writer George Marceline hoped to counter the xenophobic and Puritan critics of the king's architectural policies by publishing The Triumphs of King James I. Interpreting the peaceful unification of Scotland and England in terms of musical harmony, Marceline noted that the Kabbalists affirm that the fall led to the loss of harmony or wisdom, which was in primordial man. By manipulating Hebrew words and numbers, Marceline portrayed James as the Kabbalistic and Pharagorum restorer of unity. And coming to divination by the numbers appropriated to their characters, excogitated first of all the Pythagoras, the traditions where are no other thing, but a very Hebrew Kabbalah grounded upon this place in the book of wisdom. God hath made all things in number, weight, and measure. As the 107th king of Scotland, he hath contributed more alone by himself to build a temple of God, and to reform the service therein, than all the kings together have done. Speaking to the often antagonist English Parliament in 1619, James portrayed himself not only as Solomon, but Pythagoras, who took an oath of silence and then underwent 2 7-year apprenticeship in the art of kingship. While his supporters continued to draw on Hebrew traditions to defend his policies, his enemies condemned him as the crypto-papism of Scottish Judaizers, an odd linking that would be repeated over the next decades. His critics also disapproved of the royal permission given to Jewish scholars as a Jacob Barnett to work, such as Jacob Barnett, to work with Isaac Casaubon and other Hebraists on the King James authorized edition of the Bible. What? His critics also disapproved of the royal permission given to Jewish scholars such as Jacob Barnett to work with Isaac Casaubon and other Hebraists on the King James authorized edition of the Bible. When Calvinists at the universities tried to arrest Barnett after he refused to convert, James provided him protection and a safe conduct out of the kingdom. The king also encouraged the studies in Kabbalism inspired by the Rosicrucian movement on the continent, and he employed many figures associated with Rosicrucian, such as Welsh, John Dee, English, Robert Flood, and Scots, David Ramsay and Robert Keir, and the Mackellow brothers. However, he did not approve of the rapid anti-Catholicism of the more militant Rosicrucians, who pressured him to mount an anti-Catholic military campaign in Europe. James was scorned by many parliamentarians and preachers for his refusal to defend his son-in-law's assumption of the Bohemian crown, which he believed was illegal and would lead to widespread religious wars. Many historians now argue that his determined and wise pacifism allowed Britain to avoid the carnage of the 30 Years' War. As at James's funeral in 1625, Bishop Williams urged his audience to read the king's proclamations for buildings and the scriptural chapters which describe the collaboration between Solomon and Hiram of Tyre. Because James's effort to build up the churches replicated Solomon's building of the temple, he will be remembered forever as Great Britain's Solomon. I'm going to end that there, guys, because I gotta digest what I just read, and hopefully I will be able to read more. I'm not sure. Looks like we are halfway through, and it looks like that I still have the ability to be able to read this. So, by the grace of God, we'll be able to finish it. It's all in His hands. So, until then, keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters, and your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. I love y'all. Bye-bye.